Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from Shenandoah University is my friend Jonathan Noyalas. Jonathan, go Bills.
Go Bills.
All right.
Yeah.
So you've got lots going on to be excited about this semester, and we're going to get into our main topic, Phil Sheridan, here in just a moment. But just quickly, you had a big week at the university because of some of the stuff you've been doing related to the university's history, and I wanted to give you just a chance to kind of show off about that because I think it's a really cool project.
Yeah. So Shenandoah, right now, we're in the midst of our sesquicentennial. And so for the past couple of years, I've kind of functioned, I'm going to say, as the unofficial university historian, and figuring out ways to make Shenandoah's history, first of all, known and then accessible to the public. So going back to January of 2024, I co-taught a class about Shenandoah's history, and it really was a research class co-taught with my colleague Warren Hofstra, where we had students just took a semester and just dug through the archives, just trying to figure out, how much information can we find out about Shenandoah? What is it that makes Shenandoah unique? The values that have defined Shenandoah, how community has been built. And so one of the goals was to take that history and create historical wayside markers on campus that talked about all these different things. We actually dedicated them yesterday. So, any of your viewers out there come to Shenandoah's campus, there are 10 historical markers that talk about our history from our founding in 1875 all the way up until modern times. So it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I don't traditionally not an institutional historian, but it was fun as an alum of Shenandoah and a faculty member, a great project to work on.
So a little bit of labor of love involved there then.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and I should point out, we're recording this on Friday, October 24th. So when he said the dedication was yesterday, that was the 23rd. And folks can come and explore the campus and read these signs and learn a little bit more.
Yeah. 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 There's some really amazing stories about leaders at Shenandoah, particularly like during World War II and the sacrifices that they made to keep the institution afloat. So it's a pretty interesting history.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
So, one of the other things you have to be excited about is a new book that has been released this semester. It is a new biography from Routledge about Phil Sheridan. And you're nodding your head,
Yeah.
So I'm going to fess up to everybody right up front. Jonathan knows this. I'm not a big fan of little Phil Sheridan because of his experience in the Overland campaign, which has just colored my overall view of the guy. But he's someone that you get to see doing some pretty cool things out there in the Shenandoah Valley. So tell us a little bit about your book, and then we'll kind of get into your Sheridan story.
Yeah, so this was a book that, as you know, I specialize in the Shenandoah Valley, so I've spent a lot of decades with Phil Sheridan, and this was a book that really I never set out to write. And so Paul Finkelman, who's the series editor, so this is part of a Rutledge's Historical American series. And so several years ago, Paul Finkelman, who was one of our speakers at the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah, we were having a phone conversation and the series came up and he said, would you ever consider, writing a book for the series? And I'm like, well, yeah, but about what, what figure? And so, long story short, I had recommended Phil Sheridan. Um, because there were questions I had about Sheridan, right? Living and working in the Shenandoah Valley, I understand how people whose lineage goes back to the war perceive Sheridan. It's not in a great way. They kind of see him as a little bit of an SOB. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me because there's not a lot of biographies on Sheridan. Roy Morris's biography, Joseph Whelan's biography, but not as much attention as guys like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity to kind of visit some of those stories that have been told about Sheridan, some of the myths about Sheridan, and then to try to figure out, what are some things about Sheridan that I want to know that other historians haven't focused on.
Yeah.
And I have always felt that, and this isn't a knock on anyone who's written about Sheridan, I've always felt that I never understood who he was
Okay.
and how he evolved as a human being, how he evolved as a person and as a general. It's always sort of this, well, this is what he did, but maybe not an understanding of why he did what he did, or looking at how other historians and veterans and family members, and artists and eulogists, really tried to shape his legacy for better or worse. So that was kind of the motivation for me, and the approach for this book.
And he is one of those larger than life figures, in part because he's so extroverted and he's very successful as a self promoter. And so he really does sort of assume this persona that's hard to get at, as who's the person beneath the persona.
Hmm. Hmm.
How did you go about trying to dig that out?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So let me just kind of talk about some of the big questions that I had when I was going into this. So one of the questions that came up, and people debate, where was Phil Sheridan born, right? And it seems like an easy question because you look at Sheridan's memoirs. Well, he's born in Albany, New York. That's what he writes. And then, other historians over the years have said, well, maybe he's born in, you know, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere, or whatever the case might be, or maybe he's born in Ireland. And I have gone through, all of this litany of stories, and I've come to this conclusion: we will never know where Sheridan was born.
Yeah.
And the reason that I argue in the book we will never know is because of his mother. So obviously his mother knows better than anyone where he was born. And it's interesting because Phil Sheridan, when he goes to West Point, when he graduates and receives his first commission, you have to sign your commission, where were you born? And if you look at that first commission, he puts Boston, Massachusetts
Hmm.
as his place of birth. And then I looked at census records, and some census records, he's listing Massachusetts as his place of birth. But when you get into that period, after the Civil War, when Sheridan is starting to be seen by some Republicans as a viable presidential candidate, people want to know, like, obviously, if you're going to be president, you have to be a natural born citizen. And so there were a number of newspaper correspondents that went to Somerset, Ohio, and visited with Sheridan's mom, Mary. And Mary didn't like the press. And this is one of the things I teased out in my research that no one has really ever addressed before. She could not stand journalists. So I know this is not, great for a professor of journalism to hear, but
That's right. I won't take it personally.
she couldn't stand them, because she thought, people are asking me this question repeatedly. So every time a newspaper correspondent would come to her, she would give a different answer. And so she had Ireland, Albany, Boston, Somerset, middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's interesting because you kind of get the sense that there are correspondents waiting outside of the family home in Somerset. And they're like, well, what did she say to you? What did she say to you? And they all have these different answers. And Mary Sheridan, I mean, she basically, the impression I get from the evidence is she just wanted to screw with them because she didn't like them. And so we'll never know for that reason. But it begs the question, because Sheridan says in his memoirs, I was born in Albany, and there were people after the war, James Kelly, the sculptor, who created that, very famous image of Sheridan's ride that's actually on the cover of Sheridan's memoir. He asked him, "Where were you born?" Um, and Sheridan says, well, I think it's basically Albany, but I like to tell people Somerset, Ohio, because that's where I grew up, and I don't want to offend the people in Ohio. But I don't think he ever really had a sense.
Mm.
But it begs the question, about presidential ambitions, because I know people have characterized Sheridan as someone who was a self-promoter, and we can talk about that in a moment. But Sheridan, I think it's clear to me, even though he, from 1880 until the time of his death, was brought up as a potential nominee for the Republican Party, um, it's clear that he never ever wanted to enter politics, never wanted to be president. And I know some historians have made that claim, but it's not really based on his words, his perspective. And so, I thought, well, why is there this deal then about what's the big deal about his birth? And it's clear to me from the evidence, he may in fact have been born in the middle of the Atlantic. Like, again, there's no way to prove, but you have to think about Sheridan's lineage. He's an Irish Catholic immigrant. Um, at the time that he wants to get into West Point, there is a lot of animosity toward Irish immigrants, Irish Catholics in the United States. And so I think the family felt, the mother felt that regardless of its, if we say Boston or New York or Ohio, it has to be a place in the United States that he's born, because they saw that as an obstacle to him getting entrance into West Point.
Mhm.
And one of the things I write about in the book is Sheridan was a lover of all things military from a young age. I mean, he was probably 6 or 7 years old. There was a Fourth of July festivity in Somerset, and there was a Revolutionary War veteran, William Dusenberry, who came into that town, not decked out in a uniform, just kind of wearing, normal everyday farmer's clothes. But Sheridan was enamored with him. And that is really kind of the transformative moment where, he develops a passion for history, and also for all things military. So, those were some of the kind of early, questions early on that I was looking at. And then one of the other things that I was interested in because of my work about, slavery in the Shenandoah Valley and those types of things is what is Sheridan's perspective on Black people and perspectives on slavery and those types of things, because you really don't get a sense from other biographies um, that he had a perspective one way or the other.
Mm.
I mean, I think some people make the claim that he was indifferent. And I think when you start to really dig, Sheridan, like a lot of Union soldiers, I think he goes through an evolutionary process. So,
Sure.
on the eve of the Civil War, when you have the secession crisis, Sheridan, I think, is like a lot of white people in the North. He sees abolitionists as agitators. He sees them as troublemakers. But then, as you go throughout the course of the conflict, you start to see these things where Sheridan, because of his interaction with enslaved people, is saying, okay, I see these people as human beings who are entitled to, very basic fundamental human rights. And there were some things that I uncovered in the research that I write about in the book that are, to me, remarkable. So, for instance, in 1863, when the Union Army was in Murfreesboro, there were two African American women. One whose name was, she was simply identified as Aunt Nancy, the other identified as Mary. They came into Union lines in Murfreesboro, and Sheridan brought them in. He employed both of them. And then when Sheridan left the West to take command of the Army of the Potomac Cavalry Corps in the spring of 1864, he actually sent Aunt Nancy to Somerset, Ohio, to work for his family, because he didn't want to leave her. Uh, he had an attachment to her. And then the other woman he helped, you know, start to enjoy a little bit of a life in freedom, Mary, um, she ended up moving to New Orleans after the conflict. And there's a number of occasions after the war where he visits with her. And so he kind of builds this relationship. And, you kind of see it go throughout the course of the conflict. He sees what, African Americans in the Shenandoah Valley, for instance, are doing to help Union soldiers. They're a critical part of his intelligence gathering operation, and that's why when the 15th Amendment is up for debate and ratification, Sheridan goes out and is an active campaigner for the 15th Amendment. And
Mm.
this is one of those things that, as I was doing the research, I thought I had never, other historians haven't mentioned this at all. This is a big deal.
Yeah.
If you're going out there and advocating for the 15th Amendment. And what is striking to me is Sheridan, when he was giving these speeches, and one of the features of the book is there's a collection of documents at the end that kind of capture, the essence of who he is. And I included one of his pro 15th Amendment speeches, but he basically makes the point that Black men have earned the right to vote because they have gone out, they have fought, and they have sacrificed just as much as white soldiers during the Civil War. They have earned that right to vote, and that's why he's advocating for it. So, those are some of the first initial questions I had when I was going into this, and that I delved, pretty deeply, I think, in the book.
And of course, like most of us are familiar with his wartime exploits and kind of he does this here, he does that there. But he has I think, a pretty remarkable post war career
Mhm.
that colors the way we have looked at his wartime career, because he becomes general in chief of the army. He writes a book, and those are all things that influence, in retrospect, your opinion of what he did during
Right.
the war.
Right.
Um, how do you reckon with that sort of post-war memory and its impact on his actual
Yeah.
biography?
Yeah. So, a big part of this book is memory and what he does to shape his memory in writing his memoirs, and what other historians in the moment and veterans do to try to shape his memory, as well as family members, including his wife, Irene. So, I mean, obviously, when you look at his post-war career, after the Civil War, he has numerous issues to deal with. You have the problems with Maximilian in Mexico, which Grant is sending him. Grant is saying you can't even go to the Grand Review because I don't think this war is going to be settled until the issue in Mexico is settled, because you could have former Confederates going to Mexico and regrouping and launching Civil War 2.0. And so Sheridan is doing that. He's also dealing with Reconstruction. And that's really where you first start to see um, Sheridan as the great advocate of Black civil rights.
Mhm.
And, people think, and I'm going to use this as an example. So Sheridan is berated a lot among Shenandoah Valley scholars for his treatment of George Crook.
Mhm.
And of course, the relationship between Crook, it starts to have fractures, during the Valley Campaign in 1864. It just gets worse during the Indian Wars. And then you get to the mid 1880s where, Crook doesn't handle peace negotiations with the Apaches like the federal government wanted him to do, the president wanted him to do. And it leads to Crook, asking for his resignation, which Sheridan, who was commanding general of the army at the time, grants it. And that's kind of the end of the friendship. Um, but one of the things that I write about in the book in regard to memory and how people have perceived him is this issue of Crook. And I think it really kind of exemplifies the complexity of Sheridan and how people might want to rethink a little bit who he is. So Sheridan, when he is in New Orleans in 1866, finally decides to sit down and write his report of the 1864 Shenandoah campaign. And I think people sometimes think that when these generals sit down years after the fact, that they are doing so in ideal conditions. Well, it's not, right? So if you think about 1866, Sheridan's is in New Orleans. You've got Mexico. You have the Ku Klux Klan to deal with. You have all these issues of Reconstruction to deal with. And the government's like, well, you've got to submit your report. So Sheridan writes this report. Um, and in it, he makes a statement undeniably. At the Third Battle of Winchester, he was the one who came up with the idea for General George Crook's Eighth Corps, which had been held in reserve for most of the opening part of that battle. That he is the one who created the plan for George Crook to launch a flank attack against the extreme left of Jubal Early's line that ultimately became a critical moment in Union victory. And then, of course, that makes it into Sheridan's memoirs, which are published in 1888, and understandably so, because Sheridan is going to be relying on reports to kind of jog his memory a little bit. One of the things that I grapple with um, in the book is, what are the circumstances under which Sheridan is writing, and is this a malicious statement? Is it done on purpose, or is it misremembering? Is it being distracted in that particular moment? And as I was thinking about this, I started reading Henry Dupont. So Henry Dupont was George Crook's artillery chief during the Valley campaign. He wrote a book about his experiences in the Valley. And Henry Dupont made what I think is a really kind of even keeled observation about Sheridan in regards to the Valley campaign and the relationship with Crook. And he said, you not only need to take into account what Sheridan is being preoccupied with in 1866, but you need to take into account what Sheridan wrote to Grant on the night of September 19th, 1864. And on the night of September 19th, 1864, he wrote to General Grant about obviously the great victory at Winchester, but he singled out George Crook and his command, noting that they really deserve special attention and recognition. He recommends George Crook for promotion to Major General. And so Dupont is thinking about, okay, here's what he writes in the moment in 1864. Here's what he writes 2 years later. Considering everything that's going on, um, maybe it was done not as intentionally as George Crook might have thought.
Mm,
And George Crook, he comes back to the Valley in 1889. He's still bitter, and I get it. He's bitter, and he holds that bitterness until he dies the following year. So George Crook is never going to forgive Phil Sheridan, but I think Henry Dupont's words kind of resonate with me because again, as a historian, you have to think about perspective. What's the moment? What are the circumstances and the context in which the person's writing? And then, of course, by the time you get to Sheridan writing his memoirs, I mean, he's suffering from heart disease by
mm,
this point, so it's not as dramatic as Grant with his cancer. But Sheridan, a lot of his papers, pretty much all of his papers, were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire, so he doesn't have those things to go back and reference. Um, and so again, is it terrible that Sheridan in the memoirs it gets in there that he kind of takes credit from Crook's perspective? I think it is.
okay.
And so maybe there needs to be maybe my next project is doing like a real annotated version of Sheridan's memoirs that kind of adds some of this context because yes he wrote this in 66 and 88 but here's what he wrote in 64.
Right. That'd be a great project, by the
Yeah,
way. That would
yeah,
be fantastic. And I will point out that if he's writing his report 2 years after the fact, he's been busy, obviously,
right.
and so a lot going on, a lot has happened over 2 years that may have
Mhm.
colored his memory or obscured his memory or changed his opinions, whatever
Right.
too. So I mean, like
Yeah,
I can see where just that 2 year lag itself would
yeah,
be challenging for him.
yeah, yeah.
So now I had referenced Sheridan as a self promoter and, kind of the memoirs tie into that. And you suggested, like, well, he's got that reputation, but I
Mhm.
almost heard like an ellipses after that. So,
Yeah,
how do you assess Sheridan as a self promoter or not? Because I think it
yeah.
ties into this idea with Crook.
So I know there's going to be a lot of viewers who disagree with me, but um, spending years with Sheridan and evaluating everything, I think he is not as much a self-promoter as people might
Oh,
believe.
okay.
Um, and I think there are some reasons for this. So again, to me as a historian, the things that carry greater weight and value are the things that are written in the moment rather than 15, 20, 30 years later where you have an opportunity to kind of sit back and reflect. And so if you look at Sheridan's reports written immediately after engagements or communications with superiors after engagements, Sheridan is not heaping the credit upon himself for victory. He is giving it to his command. He's giving it to his subordinates. He's recommending those subordinates for promotion. Where I think things start to become clouded um, is after his death, um, or in his final years, as other veterans start to chime in about things. So, very famously, if you look at the literature on Chickamauga, right, one of the things that Sheridan is berated for um, is he doesn't come to George Thomas's aid at Chickamauga, and that's true. Like that's an undeniable fact. But if you look at what's written in the moment, Sheridan's kind of praised for how he performs at Chickamauga because you think about the gap that opens up in the Union line and what his division tries to do to try to slow down Longstreet's assault. And Sheridan writes about this both, in the aftermath of the battle and the aftermath of the war. Like I had every intent to do so going through Rossville, but simply couldn't get there in time. If you look at press accounts, I mean, Sheridan is kind of praised after Chickamauga for what his division does, largely looking at the issue of how he responds to the Gap and Longstreet's attack. But the guy who really starts to bring Sheridan down, and there's a couple of guys really who are going to portray him as a self promoter. One of them is Don Pyatt. So Don Pyatt, there's a great biography written about him. It's called The Gadfly of the Gilded Age. Don Pyatt was on General Robert Schenk's staff during the Civil War. So Schenck was the commander of the Middle Department in Baltimore. And Pyatt was one of George Thomas's early biographers. And Chris, you would appreciate this too. This might, make you think about things twice. He just rails against Phil Sheridan. Says he was, insubordinate, treasonous, cowardly at Chickamauga. Doesn't have anything nice to say because he's writing a biography of George Thomas, and nothing against Thomas,
Right.
but he feels like, I need to disparage Sheridan's character a little bit. He also, Don Piatt in his writings also disparages the character of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman,
Mm.
and says that he doesn't see them as great generals either. Like Thomas is better than they are because, well, they were fighting against, inferior foes and all this kind of stuff. And so it's interesting. Like I was shocked when I read that. I'm like, okay, you're going to go after Sheridan, but really going to go after Grant and Sherman, but he does as well. And so, I think some of that is fabricated that
Mm.
eventually trickles into other uh, biographies. And then there's Isaac Pennypacker. So he's the brother of the governor Samuel Pennypacker from Pennsylvania. He was a very powerful newspaper editor in Philadelphia, and he just detested Sheridan. He wrote a number of essays for the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in late 1800s, early part of the 1900s, just disparaging Sheridan's character because he was being from Philly. He was a George Meade guide, and I get it. And there was obviously a lot of friction between Meade and Sheridan from the moment that Sheridan came to the Army of the Potomac because they had very different views about how cavalry should be used. And so, um, Pennypacker is the one, he calls him the American Colkitto, basically, kind of likening him to that, late 15th, early 16th century Scottish adventurer. Like he's just out there and, doing stuff for his own personal glory. And so I think that's where a lot of this stuff comes in. Because if you look at stuff in the moment, uh, you don't really see it.
Mhm.
Now, there are certainly newspapers, Democratic newspapers in 1864 in particular, that are going to trash Sheridan because they think that trashing Sheridan is going to, work to George McClellan's advantage and the Democratic Party's advantage. But it was really interesting for me to kind of go through and look at the layers of what's informing people's perspectives about how individuals view Sheridan. Because
Mhm.
sometimes, we have opinions, but maybe we don't necessarily know why we believe what we believe. And then you start to kind of do a little bit of this, backwards historiography, and you're like, well, wow, this is why this has been so prevalent for so long. But what's interesting, and I remember back in December of 2024, I spoke at Shepherd University about my Cool Spring book. And Jen Murray, who is, the great Meade scholar and took over Jim Broomall's position there, um, I was telling Jen about this, and I said, there's something that's really striking to me about the relationship between Meade and Sheridan. When Sheridan became commanding general of the Army, he had hanging in his office in Washington a portrait of George Meade.
Mm. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I remember looking at that the first time I thought, well, that's curious because I don't have paintings on my wall of people I don't like
Yeah.
and don't respect. And so I think Sheridan, if he felt he was right, he was right.
Yeah.
And I don't think you were going to sway him one way or the other. But I think he also, I think you have the ability to be able to respect someone. And I think it doesn't come out right in the relationship between Meade and Sheridan. But again, it begs the question, why are you hanging a painting of a guy who you don't like? And so I think
Right.
there has to be, a little bit of reverence and respect there for me. So it's all, it's all pretty interesting and at times pretty muddy, not as clear as some people might like to believe.
Yeah. And it really is that Sheridan Meade disconnect that probably my dislike from Sheridan has sprung.
Yeah.
Theodore Lyman, who's on Meade's staff, does
Yeah.
not write very
Nope.
kindly about Sheridan at all.
Mhm.
The way Horace Porter describes some of those interactions, not very good. Got a dog
Yeah.
barking in the background. Hold on just a second here.
No,
Woof woof. By the way, since I'll pause here for a second, do you have to be off by a certain time? I know you had a constricted
no,
time
I'm
sheet.
good.
Okay, very good. All right. So, woof woof woof. So,
You're talking about Horace Porter.
yeah, just waiting to make sure she's done. All it takes is like for a squirrel to hop up on the porch,
Yeah.
and she's like,
Uh-huh.
"Bye." So, um, When Horace Porter writes about Sheridan, not necessarily a very complimentary, and so that has colored my perception.
Mhm.
And I think that Sheridan actually does have some really good ideas about how to employ the cavalry, but he just hadn't worked them out with Meade, which I think
Right,
is
right.
problematic.
Mhm.
So there's that, and then there's of course the Sheridan Warren controversy, and that also is something that really has colored people's perceptions.
Yeah.
What do you make of that relationship?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I've gone out and given a few talks already about the book, and that's the most popular question that people ask about Sheridan and Warren at Five Forks. And and again, you know, when I look at this in the biography, Sheridan makes mistakes, undeniably. I mean, he misjudges where the Confederate flank is by like what 1,000 yards. And Gouverneur K. Warren is delayed and all that kind of stuff. And of course, Sheridan's the one who relieves Warren. But one of the things that I decided to do, that again I was kind of shocked that other historians haven't taken this approach, is to look at Grant's papers. And previous biographers really do not make great use of Ulysses S. Grant's papers. Why, I don't know, but I mean Sheridan and Grant have a relationship, um, going back to 62, 63, and of course throughout the remainder of Grant's life. I mean, I would argue that of the great trio, Sheridan, Grant, Sherman, that Grant and Sheridan have the much stronger relationship than Grant and Sherman.
Oh, wow.
That's just my perspective. Um, but within Grant's papers, when Sheridan says, "Oh, I think I can do something great here at Five Forks," and he asks for infantry reinforcements, he actually asked for Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps, which had been with him in the Shenandoah Valley. And I think he felt, much more confident. And Grant says, "I can't send Wright because he's too far away. The closest is Warren's Fifth Corps." When Grant sends Sheridan Warren, he sends a note. And the word that Grant uses is that Warren has, and I'm quoting now, defects as a corps commander. And if you feel like he is not up to par and you need to relieve him, it's okay to do it. And one of the things, and uh, I was actually having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Scott Patchen about this, and we're both of the same opinion that there are various moments during the war where Sheridan does things that people today don't like getting, firing Warren. Uh, Sheridan comes across as Grant's hatchet man.
Yeah.
Like Grant wants something done, and Sheridan's going to do it. There is one moment, I think, within Sheridan's Civil War career where he does treat an officer unfairly, and that's William Averell,
Mm.
Cavalry Division commander in the Shenandoah Valley, removes him from command after the Battle of Fisher's Hill because he wasn't pursuing as rapidly as he would have liked. When you kind of look at things in retrospect, Alfred Torbert was performing much worse at the same time, and he still keeps him. And so there is this sense, and I write about this in the book, that if Sheridan, for whatever reason, doesn't like you, he just doesn't like you and he will destroy you. But then also, like all human beings, he's very complex. But there are these moments, during the conflict where Sheridan, I think, shows a little bit of understanding. So, famously, Sheridan had a temperature, had a temper, and so, Theodore Lyman, Horace Porter, they all write about some of the very colorful language that Phil Sheridan uses when he's angry. And so there are a couple of moments during the conflict that I use to illustrate that Sheridan flies off the handle. I mean, there was one of his subordinates said that if he got angry, he had the force of a Kansas cyclone, and would just go on these terrific rants. And there's a couple of episodes I write about in the book where he sees something he doesn't like, he goes off, and then he kind of takes a moment to reflect. And I don't want to just mention these two things briefly. So right before the Battle of Stones River, Sheridan had chastised soldiers in the 22nd Illinois for not performing well on picket duty. Some of those soldiers had been captured at Nashville. And so Sheridan, thinking about this, he thought, I was kind of wrong. And so he calls the whole regiment together before the battle and he publicly apologizes to them.
Mm.
And that to me is remarkable. There's a moment and I've written about this moment before, but it doesn't appear in other Sheridan biographies, is during the Battle of Fisher's Hill. So Fisher's Hill is a battle that is very, very rapid. You know, the Confederate line just breaks pretty quickly. But as Sheridan was riding down his line as the infantry was surging forward up the heights, he came to William Emery's 19th Corps. And the 19th Corps was not moving as quickly as Sheridan would have liked. And again, he's in battle, his adrenaline's pumping in a way that I can't imagine. He's all ratcheted up. And he sees the 19th Corps not moving as fast as the 6th and the 8th Corps, totally discounting that where the 19th Corps has to attack, it's almost like a cliff. It's pretty darn steep on that far eastern end of the Confederate line. There's Confederate artillery fire raining down upon them, and so he's looking for someone to berate. And so the first officer he can find is Colonel Edward Molyneux, who is a brigade commander in Cuvier Grover's division, and he just rips into Molyneux in front of his command. And Molyneux is so upset. Fred Molyneux, who is a descendant, years ago shared letters with me from Colonel Molyneux. Colonel Molyneux was so upset that he went to William Emery after the battle and said, "I want to resign my commission, get out of the army, so I can challenge Phil Sheridan to a duel and kill him."
Wow.
Because obviously he doesn't take too kindly to being criticized. So William Emery says, "Just relax, calm down, don't resign." And Emery goes and talks to Phil Sheridan. And Sheridan, through Emery's, mediation, basically says, "Yeah, I probably was a little bit unfair in retrospect." He actually called Molyneux's brigade together several days after the battle and publicly apologized.
Wow.
Said, "I
Okay.
was wrong." And Molyneux wrote a letter back home, I think it was to his sister, and said, "That was the most remarkable, heroic thing I've ever seen in my life."
Wow.
And so you think about this as a human being, it's hard for us to admit when we're wrong.
Wow.
Now, Sheridan doesn't do it all the time, don't get me wrong. But there are moments where he does it. And I think those are things, as a historian, you kind of have to be balanced. And look, the final sentence in the biography, I make the point that Sheridan is a mass of contradictions,
Hmm.
right? And like all human beings really are. And so these are some of the types of things that I've teased out in this biography.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the Warren situation, Warren probably should have been fired months before he was. I mean, um, do you think in that moment, though, that eventually Sheridan uses his position as he rises in the ranks to eventually become general in chief? Like, do you think he uses that to kind of suppress the whole Warren thing in ways that maybe just an apology might have fixed things?
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting because, when you look at the moments where Sheridan apologizes, he's not apologizing to like corps commanders or army commanders. So it's regimental commanders, it's brigade commanders. Um, and yeah, I think Sheridan had awareness that he did some wrong things. That part of the reason that Warren is delayed is because of his misjudging of where the Confederate flank was at Five Forks. And so yeah, I think there is an effort on his part to kind of to stomp down
Mm,
those things. And so again, undeniably, he's thinking in that moment about his reputation and legacy,
right.
and isn't coming out and saying, "Yeah, I was wrong in that moment."
Now, I'm really fascinated by your suggestion that the Grant Sheridan relationship is maybe stronger than the Grant Sherman one. And I've actually been happened to just be thinking about this a lot lately because, when Grant shows up at Chattanooga and that's when he first meets Sheridan,
Yeah,
so by March, he's like, I want this guy coming east with me, and I'm putting him in charge. Like something remarkable happens in that, 4.5, 5 month period there that cements that relationship from scratch.
yeah,
So I want to kind of dive into that
yeah.
myself a little bit, but like, what's your take? How does that relationship gel the way it does and become so powerful?
Yeah, I think Grant sees Sheridan, um, and Grant's an aggressive commander. And I think he sees Sheridan as an aggressive commander as well. And if Sheridan sees something, so if you take, Missionary Ridge, right? Um, when Sheridan receives orders to go up. It's to get to like the first line of works. Don't go up to the top. And then Sheridan is thinking, as are other, subordinate commanders thinking, well, like this is crazy because we're going to be in a more vulnerable position now than if we would just go to the top. And so I remember having a phone conversation with Paul Finkelman, the series editor, about this on the phone. And he's like, well, isn't that insubordination if Sheridan just decides, I don't want to do this? Like, and I said, well, technically, I guess it is. But one of the things that Sheridan was never ever going to do was put his men in unnecessary danger. And I think we see this throughout the war. And sometimes the way to do that is to take advantage of terrain and be more aggressive and just fight. One of the things that really weighs on Sheridan, and again, this gets to the heart of I think who he is as a general, and maybe one of the reasons that Grant and Sheridan have this relationship that they do. Sheridan cares deeply about his men, and uh, there are, so you think about these moments where Sheridan has been chastised, Chickamauga, for instance. By the time Sheridan leaves the battlefield, he's lost 40% of his division. He's lost
Mm,
all of his brigade commanders. And I've had conversations with current uh, officers in the military. What is when does a command no longer become viable on the battlefield? And they're like, yeah, if you hit 40%, it's no longer viable at that point. And so Sheridan cares very deeply. There's a very moving um, part of the biography where I talk about Sheridan in the mid 1880s visiting a cyclorama of the Battle of Missionary Ridge in Chicago. And an artist, there's a correspondent, Thomas Davis, who comes and has a conversation with Sheridan. There's actually an illustration of Sheridan and Davis having a conversation with the cyclorama in the background. And Sheridan kind of divulges, he kind of lets his guard down a little bit in this interview, where he basically says, um, you know, he mourns for every soldier he loses.
mm,
So he is not about, just kind of feeding them into a meat grinder or whatever. And he cares deeply about his men. And you see that, going back to coming out of West Point, he's in service on the Rio Grande and then out in the Pacific Northwest. So I think the fact that Sheridan, I think Grant sees the care that Sheridan has for his men. I think Grant also sees, and this is an argument that Grant makes to Lincoln when Lincoln and Sheridan, or when Lincoln and Grant are trying to figure out who should take command of what becomes the Army of the Shenandoah. Because Meade is an option and William B. Franklin is an option, and then you finally get to Sheridan. And the one selling point for Grant about Sheridan is, competent, aggressive commander, but his men love him. Now, is it everyone? No. I mean, no one's going to be 100% loved by everyone. But he said there's just something about Sheridan, and everywhere that Sheridan went, he had to win over a new command.
mm,
So you think about him coming out of Samuel Curtis's Army of the Southwest as chief commissary and quartermaster officer, and then going to command Second Michigan Cavalry, then a cavalry brigade, and then an infantry division. Everywhere Sheridan had to start from scratch, and he built a relationship with those guys.
mm,
And he built a relationship because he gave the sense that he cared about them. He was going to do what he could to take care of them. Um, when he came to the Army of the Potomac as commander of the Cavalry Corps, there was understandably a lot of animosity toward him
right.
because the cavalrymen are saying, well, somebody, the successor to Alfred Pleasanton should be somebody from the Army of the Potomac. Why is Grant bringing this guy? And so there was animosity toward him, but he wins him over. And I mean, it's the Cavalry Corps that gives him the nickname Little Phil. Like
Mm,
he's not Little Phil before the spring of 1864. It's the cavalry that gives him that nickname as a sign of affection. And so he's able to do that because Sheridan, and this was one of the things that he and Meade, like he told Meade point blank when he first came there. He's like, our horses are in deplorable condition. You're overusing them on the picket line. You're overextending them on guard duty for the wagon trains and stuff. And he's like, the horses have to be taken care of. the men have to be taken care of. And Sheridan was always going to do that. And so he always had their affection. That's why, I know people like to sometimes downplay Sheridan's arrival at Cedar Creek. Horatio Wright gets the army reorganized, and he does that. But Horatio Wright wrote a letter to his wife a few days after the battle saying, I was so happy when Phil Sheridan arrived because he could do the one thing that I couldn't. Like I could physically reorganize the army in lines. He could inspire them. He could energize them. And those are Wright's words written in the moment. And, you think about there's a Confederate artillerist, Henry Robinson Berkeley, in his diary, writing real time at Cedar Creek. When Sheridan arrives late that morning, you could hear all these cheers coming from north of Middletown. And he's writing and he's like, they must have received a massive reinforcement. And then after the war, he's like, yeah, they did. It was one man, it was Phil Sheridan. And so like some of these things are can be larger than life moments, but I don't think you can deny his ability to inspire and to galvanize these soldiers. And again, to kind of go back to a point you were talking about self-promotion. I mean, Cedar Creek is the moment that kind of catapults Sheridan into national prominence. It's the thing that he is most remembered for. When he died in 1888, Cardinal Gibbons, who eulogized Sheridan at St. Matthew's Cathedral, like he spent probably half of the eulogy talking about Cedar Creek and Sheridan's ride. Sheridan hated the poem. He hated all that attention. And again, here's another, I think, a very telling moment for the skeptics out there. Uh, and this comes from George Crook. And so this, again, to me, carries a lot of weight. George Crook wrote that after the Battle of Cedar Creek, that night of October 19th, Sheridan and Crook were sitting around a campfire outside of Belle Grove, outside of Army headquarters. And Sheridan turned to Crook and he said, Crook, I'm going to get much more credit for this than I deserve.
Mm.
And so, for those like Isaac Pennypacker who want to say he's the American version of Coquito, I'd offer up that statement as evidence that maybe he's not as much of a glory hound as you think. I mean, he is after all a general.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think a lot of generals by nature want that attention, but I think the book maybe tempers some of those perspectives a little bit.
Well, I think it's also important to note too that the election's coming up, and so like he's not necessarily the one making hay out of Cedar Creek so much as sort of the political machine
Right.
that needs that victory to help Lincoln,
Yeah.
and he's not the one who's writing the poem
Yeah.
about Rienzi. So I'm gonna give. You're making me a believer. You're making me a
Yeah.
believer here. Okay. So going back to your point that it wasn't necessarily him, but it was what people were making of him that sort of
Right.
turns this promotion machine
That's
on.
right. Yeah.
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 So what would you say Phil Sheridan's greatest legacy is as we look back on his life?
Mhm. I think his greatest legacy, and I'm going to take this from one of his eulogists. So after the after he died in 1888, on the day of his funeral, there were church services, memorial services all over the United States, and there was one eulogist, a rabbi in New York City. He made the statement that Sheridan should be remembered as someone who cared deeply about his men, cared deeply about the nation, and was committed to destroying slavery and committed to Black equality. And that to me, as I think about the gamut of his life and what he does, and again, undeniably, the great negative mark on Sheridan is how he handles indigenous peoples.
Mm,
And I am blunt and forthright in the biography. He is a proponent of ethnic cleansing when
mm,
it comes to indigenous peoples. That's the reality of the situation. But looking at it in its totality, if you want to look at it from a positive through a positive lens, I would say that would be it.
mhm,
He was very deeply committed. You see that evolution through the war, and after the war, that commitment to Black equality and Black rights. African Americans in the Deep South, places where he was, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, they loved him.
mm,
They loved him very, very deeply. And again, going back to the phone conversations I had with Paul Finkelman when I was writing this, and he was commenting on the manuscript, he's like, I've never seen anyone like this before in American history, because you have someone who's a great advocate for Black rights and then just totally disregards indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And that's the whole massive contradictions about Phil Sheridan.
Wow. Wow. So I'm like I said, you're making me a believer. I'm going to move this to the top of my pile. Now I'm excited to read the
Good,
book,
good.
which just out of courtesy to you as my friend, I would do anyway. But now I'm excited. Now I'm
Yeah.
excited.
Well,
So
it's interesting. I had a conversation with a guy yesterday who read it, and he is from the Valley, like born and bred, and he's like, I hated Sheridan, couldn't stand him, and he said, I don't feel that way anymore.
yeah, okay.
And he said, I have a much more balanced perspective of things, and that's what I think historians are supposed to do: look at things with balance and objectivity.
Yeah. Well, you're always such a thoughtful, insightful historian anyway. So I knew you would bring that to this study of Sheridan, and certainly you've demonstrated that in the discussion today. So, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, just one other mention here. So there's a whole chapter in the book that looks at Sheridan's afterlife. The role that his wife Irene played, and fights over monuments and those types of things. And so uh, there's a lot of really new perspectives and new things in this biography. And I'm hopeful that people will read it. Everybody's going to have their own opinions, but I think that this is hopefully going to be an eye-opening experience for people, not just about Sheridan, but about how history is created and how what's created influences the way that we think about people in the present, and obviously the importance of historic documents and going back and doing some of your own research.
Mm, very good. Question I forgot to ask. Let me toss it in here real quick. Um, if you had to have like top three Sheridan moments of the war, what would they
Mhm.
be?
Top three moments. One would be Boonville, Mississippi.
Ooh,
So smallish engagement, right, in the summer of '62. It's his first crack as a cavalry brigade commander, where he actually, before the battle, kind of anticipates he might be attacked at some moment. So he kind of scouts and reconnoiters um, uh, the area around Boonville. Like, if I'm attacked, how can I move troops around? He did that. The Confederate attack happened, and he was able to maneuver his troops so that he was attacking both from the front and the rear simultaneously.
yeah,
And I think he was extremely proud of that moment, because he includes a map in his memoirs of this and all that kind of stuff. So he's very, very proud of that moment. Number two, I would have to say, would be the Shenandoah Valley campaign,
mm,
right? So that and victory at Cedar Creek, that's kind of the moment that puts him in the limelight, kind of elevates him to that status with Sheridan, or excuse me, with Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant. And then the other would be the Appomattox campaign.
okay.
Um, and again, I know this is one of those things where he has his detractors, but what Sheridan is able to do, and how he is able to infiltrate gaps in the Confederate line, and able to slow those Confederates down, it is significant. And again, not to play the what if game here, but there are people, there are veterans who are writing in the moment, and political figures writing in the moment saying, I think Sheridan's the real hero of Appomattox, that he's the
Ah,
hero of that campaign, and that things might not end the way they did had he not been, in his cavalry had not been so aggressive.
very good. Well, Jonathan, I appreciate you spending some time chatting with us
Yeah,
today.
absolutely.
I'm excited about the book, man.
Yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
I'm Chris Bukowski on behalf of the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.